Verse 30 of chapter 19, Jesus said, "But many that are first shall be last, and the last shall be first." And he says that exact same thing again in chapter 20 and verse 16. The next chapter. He says to the same crowd, the same congregation, he says, "So the last shall be first, and the first last." And while we're thinking about those two quotes from Jesus, we also know that the Bible says that God is no respecter of persons. So that tells me that some of the people that we think are great, God may not think they're that great. And some of the people that we don't think that much of, God may think a whole lot of them. And so many times we put such an emphasis on first. I mean, it's got to be first. You got to do this first. I got to say this first. I got to go here first. I got to get this done first. This is my first this, and this was my first that, and first. We put an emphasis and a focus on first. But God says, sometimes things that are first, they're actually last. And things that are last, they're actually first, because God looks at things differently. And, I think about the emphasis that we put on first. How many of you remember when you had your first kid? You remember your first kid? The first kid gets it all, man. The first kid gets that nursery that's just like tricked out beyond compare. I mean, there's like artwork on the walls and homemade quilts, and things are just perfect, man. Everything's framed and shadow boxed and pictures galore. And then, oh my God, the pictures, you save Everett's first curls, you save first tooths, you save, tooths ain't a word, but in Logan it is, all right? And I mean, it's just that first kid gets all the videos. That first kid gets all the pictures. I mean, man, it's just grandparents are oohing and awing. And you even gather a crowd around for the first bowel movement of that first kid. You're look, he pooped. Oh my goodness, he pooped. Then that thing starts getting a smell. Nobody wants to go near it, right? Help me. But I mean, that first kid gets it all. All the attention, all the pictures, all the memories, all the scrapbooks. That first kid, the first, right? The first kid, the first grandkid, the first baby. That second one, it's like you forget you have it, right? It gets nothing, right? It gets all the hand-me-down. Yeah, we got another kid. I'm going back to work in 3 weeks. I mean, it's just, you ever notice that? The second kid kind of gets the shaft. The first one is what's amazing. How many of you remember your first kiss? Anybody? Your first kiss? You remember that? You daydream about your first kiss, and you imagine how great that first kiss is going to be? Y'all don't got to get quiet. I know you've kissed people in this room. It's all right. Some of you wouldn't be here if it hadn't started with a kiss. Somebody help me. Amen. Right? Help me. This is real time, all right? And you imagine how great that first kiss was going to be? And then the dude had eaten onions and tried to kiss you. You remember that? You remember that? You're laughing very hard. I like that. So, you remember your first car? You remember your first car? It wasn't my first car wasn't much. I mean, my house payment now is what my first car cost. I mean, it wasn't, but it was my first car. And I was so excited for my first car. And you remember your first love? You remember these things? Your first, it just, everything was first. My first this, my first that, first. Even with news and gossip, we've got to be the first. We've got to be the first one that posted on the Facebook, right? We got to be the first person to, I got to call so-and-so and let them know what I heard. We got to be the first. We put an emphasis on the first. But sometimes it's not a bad thing to be a little later and maybe be last. Sometimes it doesn't matter about that first kiss. Maybe it's about that last kiss. Sometimes maybe it's not about that first love. Maybe it's more important to have that last love. Right? I'm reminded of a story. I love this story. How many of you ever watched the Olympics? You ever watched the Olympics, the Summer Olympics, the Winter Olympics? In 1968, the 1968 Olympics took place in Mexico. And for one of the marathons that was going on in the 1968 Olympics, there was a man that came all the way from Tanzania, which was 5,000 miles away from Mexico. And his name was John Aquari. And John Aquari traveled 5,000 miles to run in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico. He was going to run the marathon. And there were 75 people running in this marathon. And so they start out. John Aquari had trained for this. He was ready for this. This was like the highlight of his life, running in the Olympics in Mexico. John Aquari, about the halfway point of the race, got tangled up with some other runners while they were jockeying for position. And he took a very bad fall. And he busted up his knee and dislocated his knee. And he busted up his shoulder as well. And he lied there for a few moments, bleeding, cut, battered, bruised. But he didn't stay lying there. He got back up. And he started limping and walking. And that walk eventually turned into a hobble. And that hobble turned into a trot. And that trot just turned into like a walking jog. And you say, man, why in the world did he stretchers could have came and paramedics could have came. He went on with the race. Now somebody else won that race. Matter of fact, someone beat him by like an hour and 15 minutes. And when it was starting to get dark and settle, and matter of fact, they already had the medal winning station set up. And there were people still hanging around the stadium. The news media was there covering the medal presentation. And there was just maybe a couple of hundred people in the stands. They got word that somebody was still running the marathon. It was John Aquari. And now here they are. They're doing the medal presentation. The gold, the silver, the bronze. When the media heard that somebody was still running and about to finish, they left the medal presentation to go cover who was still running. You know who was still running? John Aquari. John Aquari, bleeding, bruised, battered, broken, was coming hobbling and limping to the finish of the race. And he runs across the finish line over an hour after the winner had crossed the finish line. The media runs to him and they're like, John, Mr. Aquari, why didn't you quit? Why didn't you throw in the towel? You got a dislocated knee. You're bleeding. You're battered. You're bruised. You're broken. You could have given up and everyone would have understood. Why did you do that? He said, my country didn't send me 5,000 miles to start a race. They sent me 5,000 miles to finish a race. So that day, John Aquari, 5,000 miles from Tanzania, finished in the 1968 Olympics, finished in last place. You know what? I can't even tell you who finished in first place. You can't tell me who finished in first place without getting on the Google. But you know what? I remember who finished last. And there's probably a record book somewhere that has who the first place winner was. But in my book, John Aquari was the first place winner. Because when I look at him, I see resilience. I see toughness. I see faithfulness. I see endurance. I see somebody who wasn't a quitter. I see someone who wanted to get the job done. And he knew all along he was not going to be first. But he understood there were things that sometimes they're more important than being first. Sometimes it's just a blessing to be last. And I think I learned more about his last place finish than I do the first place finish. And I want to look this morning and talk about when last is better than first. When last is better than first. How many of you in this room would say, you know what? I've not always been the first choice of somebody. I've not always been the first choice at work. I wasn't always the first choice in school. I wasn't always the first choice in my family. Anybody can relate to that? Boy, I sure can. My brother is my mama's favorite. And nobody is shy about that at all. She lets it be known that my baby brother is her favorite. He can do no wrong in her eyes. I can do no right in her eyes. My sister is my dad's favorite. And then there's me just out in left field. Hey! Now they love us all. They love us all. But they kind of, parents do that, don't we? We do that a little bit. But how many of you, you're not first at much? You're not. But you know what? Jesus said the first shall be last. Last shall be first. God's not a respecter of people. God looks at things differently. God just wants to know that you're going to be faithful, that you're going to be credible, that you're going to represent Him. And sometimes we put more of an emphasis on first than God does. I want to study the life of King David. David, we treat David two ways. We really revere David, like, wow, King David. Wow. He was a man after God's own heart. Wow, King David. He wrote the Psalms. And wow, King David was, whoa, what a king and what a military leader. And wow, King David, well, we put him up on a pedestal. Or we beat him up. David sinned. David was a sinner. David had an affair. David had a female problem. David did something. David counted the people. He had a census when God told him not to do that. And because of that, David disobeyed God. David just let God do. So we either really revere him and hold him up, or we beat him down. Well, guess what? He's kind of somewhere in the middle. He's kind of a lot like us. There's days when we deserve to be applauded for who we are and what we do. And then there's days where it's amazing God still loves us. Somebody help me. Amen. And really, we're not who we are on our best day, and we're not who we are on our worst day. We're somewhere in the middle, right? At least I am. Are you like me? Okay. I'm starting to think you don't like me again. I want to talk about David. And we're going to look at when last is better than first. Let's look, number one, how David wasn't the first selection. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 16. Let's look at when David wasn't the first selection. 1 Samuel 16. Now, David was the youngest of his brothers. And he had a father named, anybody know? Jesse. And it was time for the high priest, Samuel, to come and anoint a new king. And God said, Samuel, Saul is no longer going to be king. I want you to go to the house of Jesse, and I've called and chosen a king out of Jesse's sons. And when you get there, you'll know who it is. So Samuel the prophet goes to Jesse's house, David's daddy, and Jesse has gathered all of his sons there, except one. Let's look at chapter 16, verse 1. David was not the first selection. Look at 16, verse 1. And the Lord said unto Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil, and go, I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. Look at verse 5. And he said, they say, okay, Samuel's coming. Samuel's coming. He's coming from the Lord. He's got business here to do. So the people in town, they start inquiring, why is the high priest coming here? And verse 5, and he said, peaceably I am come to sacrifice unto the Lord. Sanctify, set apart yourselves, and come with me to the sacrifice. And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and called them to the sacrifice. So he wants Jesse and all of his sons to come so he can look them over and see who God's going to choose and anoint to be king. Verse 6, and it came to pass when they were come that Samuel looked on Eliab. And he said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. For man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Boy, isn't that good? You ought to say amen right there. That's a good thing, right? Aren't you glad God doesn't look on the outer? I don't like my outer sometimes. Who doesn't like their outer sometimes? Help me. I'm looking at you. You shouldn't like your outer sometimes, all right? God doesn't look at that. God doesn't look at